More than 40% of the entire United States Navy, every single ship that America has actively deployed anywhere on planet Earth right now, got pointed at one narrow stretch of water. Not the whole fleet, not a symbolic gesture. 41% of everything the Navy has floating on the ocean at this exact moment, all aimed at a single Iranian coastline. And when that force actually locked into position, something happened that hadn't happened in this war before. Not one single Iranian ship broke through. Not one. That is the moment the entire balance of power in the Middle East quietly shifted. And almost nobody outside of military circles fully understood how big it actually was. To understand exactly how we got here, you need to rewind to where this entire crisis started. On February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran, and Iran responded almost immediately by doing what it has always threatened to do if it ever felt truly cornered. It went after the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway separating Iran from the Arabian Peninsula, the single most important oil transit route on the entire planet. Iran effectively closed that strait from the very first days of the war, using sea mines, small attack boats, and open radio warnings to keep tankers and cargo ships from moving through safely. For weeks, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard responded to American pressure with defiant public statements, at one point declaring flatly that the strait would not be open to what they called the enemies of this nation through what they described as a ridiculous spectacle staged by the American president. That's not exactly the language of a country looking for a quiet, easy exit from this standoff. Trump, for his part, spent late March and early April issuing increasingly dramatic ultimatums, at various points threatening to destroy Iran's infrastructure entirely, and even threatening to bomb the country back to what he called the Stone Ages if Tehran refused to reopen the strait. He also claimed, during the same stretch, that 158 vessels belonging to the Iranian Navy had already been destroyed, leaving Iran, according to his own statement, with only small, high-speed attack boats still operational. Whether or not that specific number holds up to full scrutiny, the underlying message was clear. Washington believed Iran's conventional naval power had been crippled, and it was preparing to test that theory directly. On April 8th, the two sides actually reached a temporary 2-week ceasefire, one that specifically included language about reopening the strait. But almost immediately, that agreement started falling apart. Iran continued restricting and controlling passage through the waterway, particularly as Israeli strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon kept escalating in parallel, giving Tehran an excuse to argue that the broader ceasefire conditions weren't actually being honored either. Then, on April 11th and 12th, the two countries sat down for direct talks in Islamabad, hoping to formally end the war once and for all. Those talks collapsed without any agreement at all. That failure is exactly what triggered the moment this entire story is really about. Following the collapse of the Islamabad talks, Trump said publicly that he no longer cared about further negotiations, and announced that the United States Navy itself would now blockade the strait directly, stopping, in his own words, any and all ships trying to enter or leave. U.S. Central Command quickly clarified the actual scope of that order, explaining that the blockade would specifically apply to vessels traveling to or from Iranian ports, rather than physically closing the strait itself to all shipping traffic everywhere. That distinction matters enormously, and we'll come back to exactly why in a moment. But the headline was still unmistakable. For the first time in this entire war, the United States wasn't just striking targets inside Iran anymore. It was moving to directly control the flow of ships in and out of the country. At 10 a.m. Eastern Time on April 13th, the blockade officially took effect under the direct command of Admiral Brad Cooper at Central Command. And the scale of the force behind that order is honestly staggering once you actually look at the numbers. Within the first 24 hours alone, Central Command reported that more than 10,000 American personnel, supported by more than a dozen warships and dozens of additional aircraft, were actively enforcing the operation. Not one single vessel attempted to breach that blockade during those opening hours. 6 separate commercial ships complied immediately with American orders and turned back toward Iranian ports rather than risk a confrontation. And that initial force was just the beginning. Within days, reporting confirmed that a third aircraft carrier strike group, the USS George H.W. Bush, along with additional minesweepers, was being sent to reinforce the operation, adding roughly 6,000 more troops to a region that already had over 16,000 sailors and Marines stationed there. According to an analysis of fleet tracking data, once that additional group arrived, the total American naval presence in the region reached approximately 27 Navy vessels, representing roughly 41% of every single ship the entire United States Navy had actively deployed and operating at sea anywhere in the entire world at that moment. Read that number again, because it's genuinely difficult to overstate how significant it actually is. This wasn't America sending a task force to handle a regional problem. This was America redirecting nearly half of its entire global naval presence toward one single stretch of coastline. Now here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating from a pure military strategy standpoint, because the way the United States actually chose to enforce this blockade wasn't what most people probably pictured when they first heard the word blockade. According to naval analysts who studied the operation closely, the majority of the ships enforcing this blockade weren't actually stationed inside the narrow, dangerous confines of the Strait of Hormuz itself. Instead, most of that force operated further out, in the Gulf of Oman and the broader Arabian Sea, well back from Iran's own coastline. One former U.S. Navy captain explained the reasoning behind this approach in blunt, practical terms. Modern tracking technology, linked to sophisticated air and space-based surveillance systems, means the United States doesn't actually need to put ships directly inside the Persian Gulf to enforce a blockade against Iran anymore. It can identify, track, and intercept Iranian-linked cargo from tens of thousands of miles away, long after a ship has already left the strait entirely, using satellite tracking, aerial surveillance, and a global network of assets that never even needs to enter the dangerous, narrow waters where Iran's own military actually holds a home field advantage. That single strategic decision effectively neutralized one of Iran's biggest natural advantages in this entire conflict. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy has spent years building its forces specifically around operating inside the tight, narrow confines of the Strait and the Persian Gulf itself, using small, fast attack boats designed to swarm larger vessels in confined waters, backed up by hidden weapons, caches reportedly stored in man-made tunnels carved into Iran's mountainous coastline. Those tactics work extremely well in a cramped, dangerous waterway where a large American warship has limited room to maneuver. They work considerably less well out in the open waters of the Arabian Sea, where American ships have room to operate. Air cover is easier to coordinate, and Iran's smaller, shorter-range vessels simply can't extend their reach far enough to pose a serious threat. The results of that strategic shift showed up almost immediately. On April 14th, just one day after the blockade officially began, public tracking data reviewed by international broadcasters showed that at least 4 ships connected to Iran attempted to cross the Strait of Hormuz anyway. According to multiple shipping data firms, every single one of those vessels ultimately stopped or turned around, in what was widely understood to be a direct result of interception by American forces operating well beyond the strait itself. Then, on April 19th, the blockade produced its first direct physical action of the entire operation, when U.S. Marines from the 31st Expeditionary Unit, working alongside the destroyer USS Spruance, actually boarded and seized an Iranian-flagged vessel called the Tauska. That's not a warning shot. That's not a statement released to the press. That's American Marines physically climbing onto an Iranian ship and taking control of it on the open water as a direct enforcement action. The economic pressure this entire operation generated turned out to be just as dramatic as the military logistics behind it. On April 22nd, Trump publicly claimed that the naval blockade was costing Iran roughly $500 million every single day. The Department of Defense offered its own independent estimate around the same time, calculating that Iran had lost approximately $4.8 billion in oil revenue by the 1st of May alone. Whichever specific figure turns out to be more accurate, the underlying reality is the same. Every single day this blockade continued, Iran's already struggling economy was hemorrhaging money at a scale that would be difficult for almost any country to absorb indefinitely, let alone one already crushed by years of sanctions and months of active war. There's also an important legal wrinkle buried inside all of this that's worth understanding, because it explains why the Pentagon was so careful about the specific language it used throughout this entire operation. Blockading an international waterway outright is generally considered an act of war under international maritime law. That's precisely why Central Command went out of its way, repeatedly, to clarify that this blockade specifically targeted vessels traveling to and from Iranian ports, rather than the Strait of Hormuz as a physical waterway itself. According to that framing, ships completely unrelated to Iran were still technically free to pass through the strait without interference. It was a narrower, more legally defensible operation than a full physical closure of the entire waterway would have been, even though, in practical terms, the end result for Iran was almost exactly the same. Its ships simply couldn't move freely anymore, regardless of the precise legal label attached to the operation stopping them. Naval analysts reviewing the situation at the time noted just how unusual and resource-intensive this entire approach actually was. According to one detailed breakdown published by defense researchers, effectively enforcing this kind of blockade required not just warships, but a specific mix of assets working together. Aircraft carriers to provide surveillance planes and fighter jets for combat air patrols, destroyers positioned to physically intercept and board suspicious vessels, minesweepers specifically deployed to begin clearing the sea mines Iran had already scattered throughout the strait during the earlier phases of the war. According to reporting at the time, 2 U.S. Navy destroyers had already begun active mine-clearing operations inside the strait itself, even while the broader blockade was being enforced further out, a genuinely dangerous task. Since analysts pointed out that both military and commercial vessels can actually become more vulnerable to mines and other Iranian strikes specifically while attempting to leave the strait, rather than while entering it. This entire operation also placed an enormous strain on the sailors and ships actually carrying it out, a detail that's easy to overlook when you're just looking at numbers on a map. The aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, which had already been redirected from an earlier mission in the Caribbean before eventually arriving in the Middle East, reached its 296th consecutive day of deployment during this exact stretch of the operation, setting a record for the longest continuous deployment by an American aircraft carrier since the Vietnam War. Think about what that actually means for the thousands of sailors serving aboard that single ship. Nearly a full year at sea, supporting one of the most complex, high-stakes naval operations the United States has undertaken in decades, with no clear end date in sight at the time. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, addressing reporters during this exact period, delivered a line that captured the sheer scale of resolve the Pentagon was projecting throughout the entire operation. Asked how long the United States was prepared to maintain this level of pressure, he simply said, "We can do this all day." Whether or not you find that kind of confidence reassuring probably depends heavily on how you already feel about America's broader involvement in this war, but there's no denying it reflected the genuine scale of commitment sitting behind this operation. This wasn't a limited, symbolic show of force. It was, by every available measure, one of the largest sustained naval operations the United States has conducted in the region in recent memory. The international reaction to all of this tells its own important part of the story, too. Australia's own naval chief publicly stated that his country's navy stood ready to help open the strait if called upon. Canada issued a formal condemnation of Iran's attacks, emphasizing how critical it was to keep the waterway open for global shipping. The United Kingdom went even further, hosting an international conference bringing together 50 separate countries specifically to discuss a coordinated plan for reopening the strait, and later announcing it would deploy its own drones, fighter aircraft, and a Royal Navy warship to join the broader international effort protecting commercial shipping through the region. Even China, a country that depends heavily on stable oil flows through exactly this waterway, weighed in directly, with its own leader stating publicly that the Strait of Hormuz needed to remain open to normal navigation, describing that outcome as being in the common interest of the entire international community. And here's a detail that adds an entirely separate layer of global tension to this whole situation. While all of this pressure was building around Hormuz, China simultaneously moved to block the Scarborough Shoal, a contested area in the South China Sea completely unrelated to the Iran conflict on the surface, but one that immediately raised eyebrows among analysts watching global shipping chokepoints as a category. It's hard not to notice the timing. While the world's attention was completely locked onto one blocked waterway in the Middle East, a separate global power was quietly asserting control over a different strategically important waterway thousands of miles away. Almost as if testing how much bandwidth the international community actually had left to react to a second crisis happening somewhere else at the exact same time. There's also a human side to this entire operation that's easy to lose beneath all the strategic numbers and tonnage figures. Every single one of those 27 ships and roughly 23,000 personnel involved represents real sailors and Marines, many of them already deployed for months before this blockade even began, now facing an open-ended assignment with no clear return date attached to it. Families back home had to adjust to the reality that a mission originally framed as a temporary regional response had quietly become one of the longest sustained naval operations in recent American history. And on the other side of that same waterway, ordinary people across the Gulf region, from oil workers to shipping crews to families depending on that trade for their income, watched an economic lifeline get squeezed tighter and tighter, month after month, with no guarantee of exactly when or how it would eventually loosen again. So, did this massive blockade actually accomplish what it set out to do? The honest answer is complicated and depends heavily on which specific outcome you're measuring. In terms of raw military effectiveness, the results were genuinely striking. No ship successfully broke through the blockade during its active enforcement. The handful that attempted it were tracked, intercepted, and turned back, exactly as designed. The economic pressure on Iran was severe and measurable, with independent estimates putting the daily cost in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But in terms of actually forcing a faster diplomatic resolution, the picture is murkier. It ultimately took until mid-June, roughly 2 months after this blockade first took effect, before Trump and Iran finally announced an agreement to end the war and reopen the strait for good, with the formal memorandum of understanding getting signed on June 17th, and Central Command officially announcing the removal of the naval blockade of Iranian ports just 1 day later on June 18th. And even after that agreement was signed, the numbers kept telling a complicated story. Iran's own parliament speaker publicly claimed, weeks after the blockade had already been lifted, that Iran had been completely unable to export any oil at all during the period the blockade was in effect. But independent data from a maritime intelligence firm that tracks global shipping showed something different, indicating that Iran's crude oil exports had actually still reached around 260,000 barrels per day throughout the month of May, right in the middle of the supposedly airtight blockade. That gap between Iran's public claim of total economic paralysis and the independently tracked reality of continued, if reduced, oil exports tells you something important about how both sides in this conflict have consistently shaped public narratives to serve their own political needs, regardless of what the underlying shipping data actually shows. So when you step back and look at the full picture, what actually changed in the Middle East because of this blockade? For roughly 2 months, the United States effectively demonstrated that it could redirect nearly half of its entire global naval fleet toward a single choke point and enforce genuine physical control over who could and couldn't move ships in and out of an entire country, without ever needing to fully close an international waterway to everyone else in the process. That is a meaningful demonstration of raw naval power and logistical capability, one that regional allies and rivals alike were clearly watching closely, given how many other countries felt compelled to publicly weigh in, offer support, or quietly reposition their own strategic priorities elsewhere in response. But it's also worth being honest about the limits of what military pressure alone accomplished here. The blockade didn't end the war on its own. It took 2 more months of additional fighting, additional negotiations, and additional diplomatic maneuvering before an actual agreement got signed. And even the economic damage, as severe as it clearly was, didn't fully halt Iran's ability to keep at least some oil moving throughout the entire period. Sometimes, the most accurate way to describe an operation like this isn't that it single-handedly changed everything, but that it dramatically raised the cost of continued resistance to the point where continuing to hold out eventually stopped making sense for the other side, even if that realization took considerably longer to arrive than the initial show of force might have suggested it would. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think this naval blockade was the single biggest factor that ultimately pushed Iran towards signing that final agreement in June? Or do you think Iran held out through months of this pressure, specifically to prove it could absorb the cost without folding immediately, only agreeing to a deal once the terms genuinely worked in its own favor? Let me know exactly where you land in the comments below, because I read every single one, and this is exactly the kind of story where I think hearing different perspectives on what actually worked matters. And if this breakdown helped you understand just how massive and complicated this entire naval operation actually was, do me a favor and share it with someone who's been trying to make sense of this war too. We're going to keep tracking how this new balance of power in the region continues to play out, because based on everything we've seen so far, the Strait of Hormuz almost certainly hasn't seen the last chapter of this story either.